Long Way Round. I'm your host, Malcolm Byrne. Thanks for joining me here on the show. This week I have a return engagement by some of my favorite guests that I've had once previously on the show, the Duran. And the Duran is Alexander Mercouris and Alex Cristoforou. Alexander reports from London, UK, and Alex reports from various places in Cyprus, although sometimes he's also in Athens, Greece. The Duran is the number one geopolitics podcast in the world with 335,000 subscribers, and I would guess increasing as we speak, even as we speak. Their daily audience regularly numbers more than 100,000 viewers. The Duran airs live daily on several online channels, including YouTube, Telegram, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Rockfin, and several others. And also on Locals. Audio-only shows are on Spotify, Apple Tunes, and SoundCloud. In fact, I think it's correct to say the Duran can be seen and heard nearly anywhere on the internet if you just search the Duran. Both Alexander and Alex have extremely popular individual daily shows as well, which can be found on YouTube and the other outlets that I already mentioned. The Duran also frequently hosts special guests who engage in roundtable discussions on global geopolitical issues, although perhaps of greatest audience interest over the past year has been Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. I recommend that you also subscribe to them on Locals at theduran.locals.com and support their work. A few of the ways to support are on Patreon and Subscribe Star. And finally, they have some great merchandise at the Duran shop, 10% discount. Just use the words "Good Day." Alexander and Alex were my guests last year, not long after the Ukraine conflict started on February 24th. So we're coming up very quickly to the first anniversary of this terrible conflict, although it's been going on for many years prior to that, but it really just sort of made the headlines last year. And it's an honor to have them both back on my show, as they're extremely busy guys. Alexander Mercouris and Alex Cristoforou, welcome back to The Long Way Round. And this show was pre-recorded, so we'll pick it up from where I started recording earlier this week. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you back on the show. And it's been, well, I guess it'll be almost a year soon since the invasion of Ukraine. Not quite a year since you last were on the show. And an awful lot has happened. First and foremost, I want to congratulate Alexander. You just reached 200K on your own channel. Well done.
Thank you.
And also, I don't know if you saw the Roger Waters speech to the United Nations Security Council, where he actually mentioned your show as a he cited you guys as an alternate place to find information. Credible information, that is.
Wow.
So that was quite a shout out, I'd say.
Yeah.
I don't know how much those people with wax in their ears are going to pay attention to Roger's intelligent and as informed as he is, but nonetheless, somebody was listening. Let's start off by talking about Alex, I should say. Sorry, the Elensky curse. I'm Canadian, so. Go for it.
Well, Justin is next. That's the talk. That Trudeau is on thin ice, and I don't know how it's going to happen or what the reasons are going to be. But the last two leaders that have stepped down, Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand, and just the other day, yesterday or 2 days ago, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, they just kind of said they're tired. I mean, that was kind of their excuse. I've been in power for 8 years, and it's time for me to step down. I mean, we all know there was a lot of other issues for the reasons for them stepping down, but they're gone, and we've had a lot of leaders who have since the beginning of this conflict who have resigned or have been elected out or have just opted out of the world scene. There's Draghi in Italy. Of course, there's Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, all within a month's time, and the government in Bulgaria and Australia as well, Morrison in Australia. And I just find it interesting because these are the same people that continue to yell and shout, Putin must go, regime change in Russia, we're going to overthrow Putin. And it seems like they're the ones that are being escorted off of the world stage.
Yeah. Well, Trudeau wouldn't be my favorite prime minister. I actually liked his father quite a bit, but I think his father, Pierre Trudeau, was a rather different individual. Justin, amongst my cohorts, is very unpopular. His handling of the truck convoy back in 2020 was what really caused a lot of upset with some of my friends and neighbors and so forth. So I wonder how long, for example, Olaf Scholz and even Greece's favorite son, Joe Bidenopoulos, will last, because the Seymour Hersh pipeline bombshell certainly is slowly having some seismic waves occurring. Alexander?
Indeed so, and in fact, I'm going to make a suggestion. I think it's the biggest single piece of news we've had since the invasion itself. I mean, there's been lots of other news. Alex and I, we go into the weeds every day. We talk about, what's going on in this battle and that battle, who's advancing, who's retreating, all those things. We've talked about the 10 cycles of sanctions that have been, all that. But if you want to have a story that, to my mind, brings it all together, demonstrates its importance, demonstrates the nature of some of the people involved in this war, and explains ultimately why it's come about. Well, all you need to do is read Hersh's article, because I have to say it is jaw-dropping stuff. I mean, it really is. It's the case of a small group of people who've now managed to leverage themselves into a position of extraordinary power in the United States, making decisions, attacking the energy infrastructure of one of the United States' most important allies and friends, a member of the NATO alliance, plotting to do it before the war even began, involving another NATO state, Norway, in their plans and their schemes, and of course doing so in ways that disregard US laws and bypass Congress. So, I mean, it's an astonishing story. I mean, we were talking about this, I think, the other day, and I was saying, just compare this with Watergate, for example, which was a big scandal in its day, huge scandal, but rightly so, in my opinion. But that was a botched burglary, followed by a botched cover-up, which the bungling president who ordered it, I mean, he actually tape recorded himself doing it. I mean, this business with the Nord Stream pipelines is on a completely different scale. And if you want to understand why there's a crisis in international relations, why there's a conflict in Ukraine, you really need to go no further than look at this.
I just watched Seymour Hersh finally broke silence and did an interview that came out, I think, just yesterday on Act TV. It's a Munich-based YouTube site. And he got into some of the details, although he's very guarded about his sources, of course, naturally, as one would be. But it's interesting how there's been such a deafening silence for the most part in the U.S. media, certainly. I don't know what it's like over there for you guys, but here it's either not making the news or it's being discredited because he only had one source. And it sort of discounts this incredible career, starting with the My Lai massacre in 1971, which he revealed, the Watergate, Abu Ghraib, and various other stories. And it just seems to me that this is going to backfire big time for Biden and his administration. There's no doubt in my mind about that. So.
I agree. I think that the more we hear from Hersh, and he's given an interview which I haven't yet caught up speed with. But he gave another interview yesterday with Berliner Zeitung in Germany. I think, by the way, he's absolutely right to focus on Germany, because that's obviously the epicenter of this story. But the more I hear from Hirsch, the more clear it's becoming to me that he's not got his information from just one source. And I think this is a myth. I mean, I can see why people might read the article and conclude that, but clearly more than one person has been involved in informing Hirsch about what happened. And I think this is a red herring issue, actually, that people have been bringing up. I think Hirsch is absolutely right, by the way, not to give any information about his source and sources. And I ought to say that I'm getting increasingly irritated that there are some people out there who ought to know better, who have been second guessing and trying to work out who those sources are. But the long and the short of it is, I think you're absolutely right. I think this is a slow detonation bomb. It is gradually exploding. I saw just before we started this program that somebody, a journalist, has claimed that he actually received an anonymous warning from somebody who was involved in the Baltorps exercise, the NATO exercise, which served as cover, that this person, this generally anonymous source, came forward and actually warned him about what was going on, and this before the Hirsch story broke, apparently. And I should say that in Britain, the silence about this story is even greater than in the United States.
Really?
Absolutely. I mean, if you go to The Guardian, for example, which is, the newspaper that lots of left-wing people read, you will find no trace of it there. You will find no trace of it in the Financial Times. You will find no trace of it on the BBC. It's as if it never happened. But that in itself tells us a great deal. It tells us that they're very embarrassed and nervous about this story. And of course, in Germany, it's different. There you see that Hirsch is able to give interviews, not just to, small news shows, but also to proper newspapers like Berliner Zeitung. And this story is gradually beginning to gain traction. And I've been in contact with people in Germany, and they tell me it is discussed there. And it's raised questions. Questions have been raised about it in the German government. And of course, it is in Germany that is the epicenter of this and where this thing could easily explode.
One of the things that Hirsch talked about yesterday in the interview that I watched was the kind of, what should I say? He mentioned the press conference. I don't know if you recall seeing it, where Biden basically said, this was back last year, he said, "We will find a way." Someone had asked him a question, and Joe Biden said, "Don't worry, we'll figure it out." And Olaf Scholz was right there, and Scholz's response was kind of not benign, it's probably not the right word, but he didn't really say anything. But I wonder what on earth his real response is like. Well, Hirsch's conclusion was Joe Biden basically was saying, we'd rather forward American economic and military power and let Germans freeze, essentially is what he said. So, imagine trying to explain that to your own people. I mean, fortunately, the winter in Europe hasn't been quite as bad as perhaps it might have been, but nonetheless, I mean, had it been one of those colder winters, I mean, you can imagine. And if I was a German, I would be I don't know what I'd be doing. I wouldn't be sitting here talking about it, that's for sure.
I am going to say this. I personally have been reading what Hirsch has been saying in his Berliner Zeitung interview. I get the strong impression that he does not think that the administration briefed Scholz. I know there's been a lot of rumors about this, that Scholz was somehow in on this. The whole point about blowing up Nord Stream was that they didn't trust Scholz. So that's why they decided that they needed to go ahead and blow it up. So I don't think they briefed Scholz. They might have briefed other people in Germany. But I think this would have been so controversial and dangerous that they would have been very, very careful to make sure that the people they briefed were people who they considered completely reliable. Yeah. But you're quite right. I think this is going to have an impact in Germany. Scholz is known to be already very angry, personally angry, because he was pushed to agree to send tanks to Ukraine. He didn't want to do that, but he was maneuvered into doing it. Members of his own government intrigued to enable it, to force him to do it. He's apparently very, very angry about that. And, he doesn't brief me. I haven't spoken to him. But I must admit that I can't help but think that he must be even more angry now that he has read about this thing. I mean, the fact that the administration won't trust him, the fact that the administration has done this precise thing. Bear in mind, there are many people in his own party, the SPD, who valued the relationship with Russia. Mm-hmm. The relationship with Russia was launched by the SPD back in the 1969, when the former SPD Chancellor Willy Brandt launched his Ostpolitik policies. So this is in some way their policy, their signature foreign policy. So they were never really happy about the whole direction of events. German business community isn't happy. The German unions, a major, prop of the SPD, they can't be happy either. And I don't believe that Olaf Scholz is happy too. But of course he's in coalition with two parties, the Greens and the FPD, who are strong supporters of the war and strong supporters of Ukraine. And in the case of the Greens, bitterly hostile to Nord Stream. And I think that the thing that is holding him back is his concern to hold his coalition together, and also the fact that he is well aware that within Germany itself, there's a very, very powerful Atlanticist current, if I can call it that, within the German political and security establishment and media establishment, which Scholz himself is very wary of antagonizing. So I think this is making it more difficult for him to come out and speak openly. And the fact that even the Germans are tiptoeing around this issue, it shows how sensitive and difficult potentially it is for them. And they worry that if it comes out, which it may do, I mean, this is a difficult story to control, that the effect on the stability of the German government and on the future direction of Germany may be grave, and that the political crisis could be explosive.
I see. Alex, you've mentioned on numerous occasions your feeling that a lot of the impetus for America's push for this war really is to deindustrialize Europe, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, the impetus for Nord Stream, according to Hirsch, was to make sure that Germany stays committed to Project Ukraine, because they understood that as Germany goes, so does all of Europe. So they knew if Germany started to backtrack and after recognizing the damage that the sanctions were doing to the German economy, and after recognizing the truth as to how the war is going, and Seymour Hersh said that in his interview, that we're being lied to about the actual progress of the war, and we're being lied to with these. And this was back in September, October, November. We're being lied to about how well Ukraine is doing. And Seymour Hersh said, I knew the truth as to what's going on in the war. And the Biden White House, they felt like once all of this stuff came together for the German leadership and for the German people, they would say this is not worth it, and they would reopen Nord Stream, and that would be that. And then all of Europe would follow, and the whole Ukraine project would come to an end. And for Biden and Nuland, Blinken, Sullivan, these four individuals who are, I guess, the masterminds of this Nord Stream plot, they couldn't let that happen. So, all of Nord Stream, the entire conflict, yes, it has been about destroying Russia, but it's also been about keeping Germany down and weakening Germany and making Germany and Europe dependent on the U.S. I think Hirsch said in his interview with the Berliner Zeitung that there were people who were advising Biden who said the blowing up of Nord Stream would be good for the U.S. economy in the long term.
Well, Blinken said that. He said that.
It would be good for the U.S. economy in the long term.
Yeah.
Because they felt that Europe would be 100% dependent on U.S. energy. Well, U.S. and Norwegian energy, because we now know the benefits that Norway got from this by removing the big competition, which was Russia. And they felt this would play good for a re-election of Biden. This would be good for the U.S. economy. And it would mean that the U.S. pretty much had a monopoly status over Europe.
Well, I don't know how much you're into Martin Scorsese films, but, many of his films focus on his Italian heritage and the Goodfellas and the thugs that he, saw when he was a kid growing up. I mean, this to me sounds like it just sounds like the kind of thing that the mob. Hirsch actually said this yesterday in this interview. He said this is the kind of behavior, when the thugs would come around to the mom and pop store and say, "Look, we're your insurance. You either sign up with us or you're going to have your building burnt down and your business is going to be gone." I mean, this sounds like the kind of thuggery that one would associate with the Gambino family or something back in the 60s and 70s. It's just insane,
This is huge. This is a very, very big deal, and the fact that the media is not reporting on this in Europe, in the U.S., in the UK is indicative of the fact that they believe that Sy Hirsch is correct.
Yeah,
I think they don't want to dig into this, and they're trying to distract with this whole sources thing. Oh, he only has one source, or two, or five, or 10. If he had 10 sources, it would be too little. If he had 10 sources, it would be too much.
Right.
He has one source, it's too little. They're just trying to distract away from the fact that they also recognize that Sy Hirsch's reporting is pretty spot on, and it sounds pretty much like how this thing went down. We all had our suspicions when this happened. We all knew it was it the US? Was it the UK? Was it Poland? Was it a combination of countries? We all understood that this wasn't Russia blowing up its own pipeline. And now that we understand the details as to what happened in Sy Hirsch's reporting, everyone is afraid to dig into the story or to try to refute Sy Hirsch's facts. So instead, they're focusing on the whole source thing or his age. He's 85, so he can't make reliable reports or stuff like that. They know what happened.
Yeah,
they know what happened. They don't want to dig into it. This is massive, because if the UN doesn't investigate this and get to the bottom of it, then what does this mean for the world? I mean, does it mean that Russia can take out communication pipe networks, cables? Why not? Can China shoot down satellites that it doesn't want to be hovering over its territory? Why not?
Yeah. The implications are immense.
Yeah, the fact that the Biden White House even thought up of this is incredible. Trump got impeached for allegedly calling Zelensky and telling him to back out of, I even forget, it was some silly transcript that he got impeached over. And here we have a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, a credible journalist with credible sources, documenting what many people believe was what actually happened in this sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. And no one wants to dig deeper. The Republicans aren't digging into this. They're having House meetings with Twitter and censorship and stuff like that. They should be all over this.
Well, they're busy organizing Marjorie Taylor Greene led Montana holiday balloon shoots. Package tour to Montana. I want to focus now, because I know we're not going to have a lot of time. I want to focus now on the human aspect of things. I did outline that in the email that I sent you both. I don't know how much you watch some of these Telegram channels. There's a couple of sort of military channels where, as far as I can tell, it's either, soldiers on the front lines uploading dash cam, iPhone stuff, but it's pretty gruesome. I saw something just yesterday or the day before of a young Ukrainian soldier being taunted by, I don't know whether they're DPR or Wagner group people, but whatever. Human beings are human beings, and war crimes are war crimes, and it doesn't matter to me whether they're Ukrainian or Russian or American. This poor guy was being made to dance for his life, and you could tell he was being, a gunshot went off, and the look on this poor young man's face was just unbearable to see, and some of the physical damage that you see to the human beings that are being basically an artillery war. It's gut wrenching and it heartbreaking. And Alexander, I mean, you're just about to see a new life born. Imagine that life ending up in that circumstance. It's unimaginable.
It is utterly horrifying. Can I just say, every day I go through these Telegram channels that you're talking about, I see extremely disturbing things there. I don't look for them. No. They are there sometimes because I have to see them. I mean, one of the things we do is we do try to provide, up-to-date coverage of what's actually going on. And sometimes the way you know what's going on is that because people on the actual battlefronts say, look, we've just captured this village and we can show you that we are at this village because this is the picture of the village, this is the church, this is the thing. So that helps you to know what is reliable and what isn't. Yeah. But of course, alongside that, you see all sorts of terrible things. And this is deeply upsetting. It is extremely upsetting. Now, you're quite right. Whoever's doing this, and, let's be clear about this. This is a war. You can say one side is doing it more than the other, but it is happening. Both sides, there are going to be bad people who do terrible things. But war itself is a terrible thing. I was born in the 60s. I knew lots of people in Britain in the 60s and 70s who'd fought in the two world wars. I knew a few people who'd fought in the First World War who were still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of their First World War experiences, shell shock, as it used to be called. And, of course, the artillery densities that are being used in this war are actually much greater than anything that happened in the First World War. So, I mean, the effect of this war, the damage it must be doing, and one has to say principally to Ukrainian men, because the overwhelming weight of artillery is from the Russians against the Ukrainians. On average day, the Russians fire 4 times more shells than the Ukrainians do, and they tend to be much heavier shells. I mean, that's an aspect of the war people don't talk about. But the Russians have much more heavy artillery than Ukraine does. So the damage, the trauma that this must be doing to people in Ukraine, the population, the male population of Ukraine, is unthinkable. And on top of that, you see people being sent to battle. And again, I have to say that the primary victims here are Ukrainians. You see people being put together, sent in small infantry groups right into the fire of the Russian guns. Yeah. Again, it is horrendous. And it's happening every day. It happens every hour of every day. And it's been going on now for a year. And I really do worry. I worry terribly about what kind of society it's going to leave behind in Ukraine. And, there are Russian victims too. Absolutely there are. And that brings me back to the media coverage in the West, the way this war is covered, the triumphalism of a few weeks ago. I have to say it upsets me terribly to read the way it's covered and the way this terrible aspect of this war is being sugar-coated as part of this, great narrative of this heroic little country. Ukraine isn't actually a little country, pluckily fighting against the Russian Goliath. It's a terrible distortion to the point, in my opinion, of being practically a crime.
I suppose if one were to project into the future and imagine, let's say 5 years down the line or something like that, you have this country which has been saturated with weaponry, which is, unfortunately got ingrained ideology amongst a certain sector of the population. I'm not even going to say neo-Nazi, it's just outright Nazi ideology. And perhaps at that point, the Ukrainian people will feel, or elements will feel betrayed, much as the Taliban rose out of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to that the classic, I forget who wrote that book, Blowback. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, Blowback.
I know the book. I also can't remember who wrote it, but anyway.
But it just seems like a classic situation that is going to just, but this is in the heart of, well, not quite in the heart of Europe, but it's still in Europe, essentially. It's hard to fathom where this could ultimately lead. But the problem is that Americans, it's so abstract here to them. All the wars that we've had now are kind of over there. We're not sending our own troops per se. We don't have the draft or anything like that. So it's not like Vietnam, where the general public was upset because obviously 18-year-old kid didn't want to go fight in Vietnam. They'd rather go hang around with hippies and smoke pot. But it just it seems so difficult to get the humanity across to people. If they could see like what John Pilger used to show back during the Vietnam War, for example, if people would be less supportive. But I find a lot of support for this conflict coming from the left, even more so than people that I know that were more Republican or certainly Trump supporters. I've had some of the most bizarre conversations with decent, intelligent, liberal-minded people saying things like, well, my biggest fear is that one day, because Putin has brain cancer and he's going to hit the red button, he's going to find out he's only got 6 weeks to live, so he'll press the button now and get it over with so he can go out with a bang. I mean, this is like the kind of crap that you hear all the time, So...
It's absolutely correct. You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the reasons, of course, we're not shown these pictures of the war, as we were in Vietnam to some extent. I mean, I remember the television films in Vietnam, and they weren't as gruesome as what I see. And I'm not asking, I don't want those pictures, all of those pictures, to be shown to people. But
we got a sense of it.
We got to see something, exactly. But of course, the reason we're not shown that is precisely because people don't want the people in charge don't want the public to have that kind of reaction, which you are speaking about. And I'm afraid one of the great problems in this war, and generally, in fact, in international relations, is the complete collapse of what used to be the anti-war left, of which, by the way, in a former life, I was very much a part. And I am absolutely bewildered at the way in which it has completely evaporated, both in the United States and in Europe. And, we've never needed it more. And it's now gone. Mm-hmm. And again, I have to say, I think that the parties of the left, or what used to be the parties of the left, the Democrats in the United States, the Labour Party in Britain, the Greens in Germany, especially the Greens in Germany, have massively betrayed their own traditions and their own constituencies. And the media, alongside with them, including what used to be the liberal media. I mean, there is no more belligerent pro-war newspaper in Britain than The Guardian, which, of course, in its earlier form, in its historic form, could have been the place which you turned to find criticism and skepticism of a war like this.
Yeah.
So this is an extraordinary thing, and I don't completely understand how it's come about.
Well, I was listening to or reading something by. Do you know are you familiar with Matt Taibbi?
Yeah,
surely you must
very
be.
Well. I remember him in his exile days in Moscow, when he was editing a rather extraordinary magazine there. But never mind. Carry on.
Well, Matt, he wrote an article about a month and a half ago. It was called the Kremlinization of Washington D.C. That was the title of the piece. It came out on Substack, and essentially, he outlined this idea that the neoconservatives, the neocons, the people that got us into Iraq, the Paul Wolfowitz and the Donald Kagans and the Bill Kristols and the Victoria Nulands and that crowd, because Iraq obviously turned out to be a dismal failure. There's no denying. You'd have to be, living under a rock to think that it was a success on any level whatsoever, except, of course, for BlackRock and people like that. But he said that essentially after Iraq, they reformulated their approach, and they thought, well, we're not going to get anywhere if we just keep going this direction. So the idea was to focus on the left, to bring the left into the narrative, and so it's a project that's been in the works for 15 years or more, and I call it and I forget who I said it to, but it might have been George Galloway. He had a bit of a chuckle when I said the Samantha Powerization of American foreign policy. So essentially what the focus now became was, we have this moral obligation, right? So when it came to Libya or Syria or countries like that, Indonesia, it appealed to the liberal mentality of, social justice. Right, that was really the point that Matt was making. You appealed to this sort of social justice idea. So currently in America, the image is of Ukraine being the poor victim of the aggressive force, i.e. Russia, and that we as America are simply aiding on a moral level this cause. And it's completely taken over the left. So if you listen to someone like Rachel Maddow from MSNBC, well, I don't know if she works there anymore or whatever, but she used to be this absolutely outspoken anti-war activist. I mean, I remember during the Iraq War, she was on a show called Air America Radio. That's where I first heard of her. And now she might as well. I mean, the words that come out of her mouth. I listened to an interview with her with someone. She might as well be parroting the words of Victoria Nuland for all it's worth. So, sorry, rambling on like that, but the floor is open.
I think Matt Taibbi is making a very, very powerful point. I have to say that he perhaps underestimates the degree of complicity that there has been on the part of some people on what is still referred to as the left. Remember that in Britain, and we were, America's main ally in the war in Iraq, the government at that time was left-wing. It was at least it claimed to be left-wing. It was led by Tony Blair, who was one of the most fervid advocates of the Iraq war, and who was, of course, the first person who came up with the whole concept of responsibility to protect, and who said that the doctrines which he wrongly attributed to the Treaty of Westphalia, that countries have a right to their own destinies, that this is out of date in some ways. So, a lot of this came from within the left itself. Now, one can't discount the fact that there's been some major social change within the left, which, again, I don't understand. And bear in mind, we've not really had a proper discussion and analysis and research on this. Why, the children of anti-war activists are now themselves pro-war, why people like Rachel Maddow have changed their positions so completely, because this hasn't really been looked into. I mean, people like Taibbi can come up with explanations, but I don't think that they are the full explanations. What I will say and this is the other side of what Taibbi has been writing about, and which I think Alex is actually better at discussing than I am, is that what we also see is an incredible intolerance on the part of the left and a willingness to engage in what is straightforwardly censorship and to take it beyond anything that I've ever seen before in the West. And again, the impetus for that has come massively from people who claim to be and who, one has to say in a kind of sense, are on the left. And that, again, seems to me such a betrayal of what, for me, the left used to be all about, that, again, I don't completely understand it.
Well, Chris Hedges, one of my favorite authors, said in a recent article that he wrote that social justice without a sense of social reform is just, it's the wrong direction. Alex, I can see you've unmuted yourself. Please weigh in on this subject.
No, I mean, you're right. Social justice is, to me, I've never quite understood the whole social justice thing. I have to be honest. I think people should inherently know what's good and what's not. And, this whole idea of social justice kind of freaks me out sometimes, because I don't understand why you need to label something social justice. I never grew up with the phrase social justice. People just knew what was right and what was wrong, and a wrong war is a wrong war, whether it's in Iraq or whether it's being waged on the streets of the U.S. in New York or in Chicago or whatever. It's violence is bad, and a war is something that we should all try to avoid. But the left and the right, I think both the left and the right have kind of merged with this conflict in Ukraine to agree that this war against Russia is the right war. And you see the neoliberal left and the neocon right; they've kind of melded into one. And you see a lot of analysts who are on the traditional left, you would say, or consider themselves traditional leftists, and you see traditional conservatives, and they're both saying the same thing when it comes to supporting Ukraine and destroying Russia, without understanding all of the context and everything that brought us to where we are. And it always amazes me to see these opposite forces who question the media on certain issues, like, say, the vaccine mandates or the lockdowns or whatever. They would always question the media or question what CNN or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal has to say about all these things, and they do a very good job of questioning narratives. When it comes to Russia, when it comes to China, it's a blind spot. It's a blind spot. And Putin evil, China evil, Syria, back when the war was Syria, Assad evil. That's that. So there was no nuance. There was no understanding the context of things. Nope. These people are dictators. They're authoritarians. They're evil, and they have to go, without realizing that perhaps they're the ones that live under an authoritarian state. Perhaps people in Europe are being ruled over a bunch of elitists who they neither elected or neither campaigned for their vote. And many people don't know who they are, and they're the ones that are passing the laws and the rules for all the people in Europe. But they don't want to see that. They want to see the guy in Russia or the guy in China, and they're the evil ones. Well, the guy in Russia provides health care for all his people. The guy in Russia is when it comes to the economy, he's pretty liberal. He took the resources, the natural resources of Russia, and he moved them back under the control of the state. They don't want to see that. They want to ignore all of that. And they're supporting the other guy who's canceling media, canceling opposition parties, canceling religion, supporting an ideology that once upon a time the left would fight against. They buy, when it comes to Russia and China, they buy into it all the time. All the time. They don't question anything the New York Times or the mainstream media says about the conflict. And that's been one of the reasons why we are where we are with this conflict, because all these people have been lied to about the progress of this conflict. And they've been going along with this escalation narrative because they thought they were winning. And now we're seeing a year later that Ukraine wasn't, they were losing. And now what do? We've boxed ourselves in.
It seems that the narrative, like I'm thinking very hard about what you said about why there's this general sense of like Putin bad, us good, Xi Jinping bad, us good. And you hear for example, here's a good analogy. We don't like Muslims and we don't like terrorists unless they're Muslim terrorists and they're in Xinjiang. Okay. For example, I've heard people, I have quite a few people in the LGBT community, friends, and they say, well, we don't like Putin, we hate Putin because they're intolerant of gay people in Russia. So that's it. That's for them.
But they don't know the law. That's the thing. They don't understand the laws that he has passed. It wasn't, and this goes back to the Olympics, because they wanted to tarnish the Olympic Games. And they felt that a way to tarnish the Olympic Games when Russia was holding them, I think it was the Winter Games in Sochi 2014, right at the same time that the Maidan coup was going. The law was an anti-sexual propaganda law. The general concept of the law, and Alexander can correct me if I'm wrong, but the general concept of the law was any individuals under 18 years old, children, shouldn't be exposed to any sexualized content in public spaces. Period.
Gay, straight, or
and it outlined all the content that they shouldn't be exposed to. But that's Russian society in general. They're supportive of those kinds of societal policies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Alexander.
No, I mean, that's exactly what it was. I mean, I was actually, just before the war began, rather the crisis in Maidan began, I was actually working on a long article about this, because I studied the law very carefully in the context of it. There was actually no new law. It was an amendment to an existing content rating law, principally for television. So the idea was that you wouldn't show certain sexual programming before certain, hourly thresholds. So, if you had children, they wouldn't be shown these things because, that would be postponed until after 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening. That's what it was. It wasn't more than that.
You mean like
now,
what
the
they
great irony,
have here?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, we're pretty much exactly like it. The problem was, of course, it was made into such a big issue in the West. Well, I mean, problem that, of course, that provoked in turn a reaction in Russia. And now you see that since that law was passed, partly as a result of the sort of toing and froing and internationalization of this issue, the Russian society, and this is, the pressure comes from below, by the way, make it very clear, has actually become even more conservative than it used to be on many of these issues. But having said that, overall, compared with most places around the world, Russia remains on these issues a fairly tolerant place. I mean, it's still possible. There are LBGT clubs
but you
in
wouldn't,
Moscow.
If you talk to people, to people that I have numerous friends like, but in Russia, you just get arrested and thrown in jail for saying anything. Like if you say one thing bad about Putin, you're going to end up in a gulag and, in Yakutsk or someplace like that. And I'm like, I think a lot of it has to do with Hollywood. I know it sounds a bit banal or simple, but I yesterday I was on a film shoot for a very popular American TV show called FBI. It's got a couple of big stars in it, and it's a real action thing. But all of the bad people were Russians, right? They were Russian oligarchs living these lavish lifestyles in fabulous penthouses and, arms dealers and all this kind of, the stereotype that Hollywood has created of, we always need a bad guy, right? So there's got to be the evil, the guy with the little white pussycat and a finger, and Dr. Evil character. Now they're all Russians or Chinese people, so, and that does have a profound effect on people's perceptions. Absolutely.
Yeah, because our oligarchs in the West are just absolutely kind, gentle, multi-billionaires. Yeah. They're wonderful people as compared to the Russian oligarchs, right? They
just go to they just fly on the Lolita Express and go to Epstein Island.
Yeah, exactly. They don't go to Epstein Island or anything like that. And the Russian oligarchs are peanuts compared to the U.S. oligarchs of Zuckerberg and Gates and Musk. I mean, these guys are worth $150 billion or $200 billion. A Russian oligarch is like $10 billion, $5 billion.
Cheap change, really.
I mean, this is like what Elon Musk makes in a month. You can't even compare the two.
Well, it's interesting how Musk has now become the bad guy too. Like, all my friends are like wondering whether they should trade in their Teslas now and so forth, because that's another story altogether. But the symbolism is what I'm saying, and this is the same kind of propaganda. Propaganda is the same word for public relations. It's just, one sounds sinister, one sounds, publicly acceptable, socially acceptable, but really, the same mechanisms that Edward Bernays conceived of 100 and something years ago in order to convince the general public of this, that, or the other thing are still being used. I mean, the Super Bowl was a non-stop recruiting. The halftime show was just like, basically it was like, come and join the military, do great things, So I know we're going to run out of time very, very quickly. So I wanted to ask Alexander if there was anything that you would like to discuss before you have to leave.
Well, we've still got little time, but can I just say this? I mean, if we're talking about media perceptions, first of all, I completely agree with you about Hollywood and about the media and about the Russians being the obvious targets. I mean, we had actually it's not bad thriller-type comic feminist thriller. That sounds a contradiction in terms, but it's not bad. It's well put together in Britain, which there's a villain who's a hit woman called Villanelle, and of course Killing Eve, and of course she's Russian. It's automatic now that a person like that has to be Russian, and of course this does create an image, and a whole image of Russia is created around it, and it's been put to me, and I actually even saw an article about this in the Financial Times. Not an article, actually, but a long letter that somebody wrote to the Financial Times, actually opposing all of this, but saying that the thing about Russia is that in some ways it's a convincing villain. It's a persuasive villain if you're approaching it in Hollywood terms, because it's big, it's powerful. We don't really understand their language, but, there's a kind of glamour to it. You can relate to it. It's the sort of place where you could imagine a Bond villain being or coming from. Whereas other parts of the world, they tried that in America once in a Bond film. It didn't really work. So that draws you inexorably back to Russia. And of course, there's a whole mythology about Russia. One of the great problems about Russia is that Westerners know very little about the country, but they think they know everything about it. They don't know many things, in fact. And I'll give you an example. I mean, just yesterday, there were the life expectancy figures in Russia came out. This isn't something that I've seen reported anywhere, but life expectancy in Russia has now grown to 73. Now, that doesn't sound impressive by comparison with some places in the West where, we're touching 80. But in Russia, it's a record. They've never had life expectancy that is so high. And male life expectancy, which in Putin's time had fallen, when Putin became president, had fallen to about the mid-50s, is now shooting up and is touching 70. So, you're a Russian. You're going to live longer. You're going to have more children. You're probably better off than you have ever been, or than anybody in Russia has ever been. But this isn't a side of Russia that people are informed about. And of course, their image of Russia, very much, Red Square, the Kremlin, tanks, marching soldiers, and of course, stories about prison camps and all the rest. So the real place isn't like that at all. I'm not saying that there aren't very dark and troubling things that happen. I'm not saying there aren't many things I don't like there. But you never get a rounded picture because the mythology about it is both so strong and it is so convenient in some ways to this sort of Hollywood machinery that, makes profits from it.
Sure. Well, the last thing I'd like to just ask both of you is what is the biggest news of the day? I hear that there's been quite a build-up along the entire front from Russia, and there's this talk of impending, everyone, I've talked to Scott Ritter a number of times, and he admits that he got it wrong. Like he was expecting this great Russian offensive, but they've completely readjusted their way of working. But given that winter is halfway through, where do you think things are going to go in the next, say, month or so?
I think we're going to see more of the same, and more of the same is this war of attrition, which everybody in the West has now started to understand that Ukraine is losing. I mean, the Russians have changed the character of the war, and they're going about it in a very methodical way, very terrifying way. I mean, we talked earlier about the program, about the effect it's having, but we can also see the first signs of panic. I was reading the Financial Times about furrowed brows amongst NATO leaders in their latest meeting in Brussels that has just happened, that they don't really have an answer to the fact that Russia is now outproducing the West in weapons systems and machines and all of those shells and all those things. They don't really have an answer to this. That's not where they found themselves. So I think what we're going to see is more of the same. The Russians now have major forces in Ukraine. They're pushing steadily, incrementally forward, and eventually, at whatever timetable they choose, they will achieve their objectives in Ukraine. And then we are going to have a major crisis in the West because this bomb that Seymour Hersh has planted, that will explode at some point. There'll be all the doubts, all the recriminations, all the criticisms. There was an article I read this morning, I'm sure Alex saw it, was reproduced on Zero Hedge, about how energy prices in Europe are now structurally higher than they would be and can be, could have been, and this is going to have a long-term effect on the European economy. We've been saying all that as well. So we are in the slow build-up to a very, very big outcome, and I've come to the view that people who are talking about a big Russian offensive, this is what they want to see in a kind of way. They like the dramatic idea, yeah. They like the dramatic. I do think this is what the Russians are going to do. But in a way, what they're doing is even more deadly, and for the West, even more dangerous, given that even the Rand Corporation is saying that the worst outcome for the United States is a prolonged war in Ukraine.
Right. Well, I would urge all my listeners to, if they have not followed you both individually and as the Duran, to please subscribe and to pay attention, because it's been going on close to a year now, and you've both been probably, in my mind, the most accurate two people on events. You've never exaggerated things. You've always provided a pretty good analytical background and a basis for things. So I, congratulate you and appreciate that from both of you. And as I say, I'd urge my listeners to check out your sites. Alex, do you have any last parting words before we say goodbye?
Just going off of what Alexander said, I've I said this way back in the beginning of maybe after the first month of the conflict. I said the slower Russia goes, the worse it gets for the West. And so I think they're going to stick to that line. The slower it goes, the worse it gets for the West. And that's what we're seeing happening. Right. And I do believe that the Seymour Hersh article changes everything. Yeah, that's a big deal.
Yeah, in another world, it would have been, all over the media, just like Abu Ghraib or My Lai was back in the 70s. But, as we've discussed on the show, there's this kind of deafening silence, and I think a lot of it has to do with a disconnect in terms of reality versus the fantasy that has been created in the public's mind about what this is and what it's all about. So, yeah. Well, I truly am grateful for you both taking the time to spend time here together with me. And I wish you all the best, Alexander. Congratulations. And I look forward to hearing what the results are. Are you one of those people who does the tests and finds out prior to things? Is it
Oh, absolutely, of course, yes.
Okay, so you know what you're in for. Yes. It's not triplets or anything, is it?
Oh, no. It's a single child, yeah.
Okay, well,
thank goodness.
Excellent. Well, congratulations, and we'll see you. And by the way, when I do get the program finished, I'll send you links to it, because I think the music that I've put together for the show, I think you'll both really, really appreciate it. So happy listening. Awesome. Okay. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Take care.
Bye.